In the previous video, we discussed the classical theory of interest. We considered the notion that interest represents a reward for the postponement of consumption, and we asked whether that idea is consistent with the nature of the real goods and services which make up the economy. Given that almost all real goods and services lose value with the passage of time, and therefore punish rather than reward the postponement of consumption, the classical view of interest seems to be at odds with the laws of nature. John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the 20th century, proposed a very different explanation for the phenomenon of interest. Consider the following passage from The Economics of John Maynard Keynes by Dudley Dillard. Most people are so accustomed to viewing saving from their own individual point of view that it's difficult for them to think of saving from the social or community point of view. Saving is, to most people, putting money in the bank, or into securities, or into the mattress or an old sock. It's only by an act of conscious intellectual effort that we think far enough into the economic process of society to realize that saving is a two-sided affair. Attempts to save which are successful so far as the individual is concerned, since he adds to his individual wealth, may be self-defeating and even positively harmful so far as society at large is concerned. Putting part of a monthly salary into a savings account means only that an individual has not spent all his income. The effect of not spending as such is to reduce the demand for consumption below what it would have been if the money which is saved had been spent. In the absence of some entrepreneur's action to invest, an act of individual saving will prove abortive for the community. It will merely reduce effective demand for consumption without any compensating increase in the demand for investment. The decrease in effective demand for consumption reduces employment and income. One of the important lessons of the general theory is that spending rather than individual saving is the essential condition of production and prosperity in an exchange economy where one man's spending is another man's income. Let's repeat that last part again. Spending rather than individual saving is the essential condition of production and prosperity in an exchange economy where one man's spending is another man's income. This casts the idea of rewarding people for postponing consumption in a very different light. Whereas the classical school views interest as a reward, Keynes essentially views it as a ransom. In his view, interest is the price that must be paid to holders of money to persuade them not to hold the medium of exchange hostage and to allow it to circulate. The reciprocity inherent in barter is the essential feature that enables society to reap the rewards of the division of labor. In fact, the very idea of selling without buying via barter is a logical impossibility, because in barter, buying and selling are part of the same act. What would selling without buying even look like in a barter economy? It's the introduction of money which makes such a thing possible. When money is introduced into the equation, buying and selling are separated into two different acts, and that creates the possibility that supply and demand will not balance, because people have the option to hold on to the money they receive from selling without making corresponding purchases. And according to the classical theory, people deserve to be rewarded for this behavior. Again, that doesn't seem to be consistent with common sense. Before we get into the details of Keynes's theory of interest, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's imagine a simple pre-monetary, i.e. barter, economy in which there are 5 individuals who produce 5 different products. Let's suppose that the 5 products in this primitive economy are meat, bread, milk, clothing, and firewood. Based on the principle of division of labor, we know that the community will be better off if each member specializes in the production of one product and uses his excess production to exchange for the 4 other products that he doesn't produce for himself, rather than each member of the community producing 5 different products exclusively for his own individual consumption. So let's say that the members of the community meet at a central location every other day in order to exchange their products. Now let's complicate the situation a little bit. Let's suppose that the producer of firewood discovers that he's lactose intolerant, so he decides to eliminate milk from his diet. Now there's a problem. How is the producer of milk supposed to get the firewood he needs to stay warm? Here we've run up against one of the many limitations of barter. Clearly, the whole community is better off if one person specializes in the production of milk and another specializes in firewood. But If barter is the only means of commerce, the community will have difficulty arranging for all of the necessary mutually beneficial exchanges required in order for the division of labor to function properly. So let's say that someone comes up with the idea of creating a form of money. By introducing money into the system, the milk producer can procure firewood even though the firewood producer doesn't consume any milk. By selling his milk to the other members of the community, he receives money which he can use to buy firewood. But there are other consequences resulting from the introduction of money into the system. Let's suppose that meat, bread, and milk must be consumed within 48 hours or else they'll go bad. Now, let's imagine that on one particular market day, the milk producer, the bread producer, and the meat producer use their money to buy firewood. Now, the firewood producer is in possession of more money than anyone else. And he knows that if they fail to sell their products before the end of the day, they'll become worthless by the next market day. If the firewood producer is looking to maximize his own well-being, how will he behave under these circumstances? Will he be willing to pay the asking prices of milk, bread, and meat? Why should he? He knows that he's in a position of power. Because of the fact that his money will maintain its value, while the meat, bread, and milk will not, he can essentially dictate terms to the producers of those products. He could offer them half of what they're asking for their products, and they'd still have to accept, because if they don't make a deal, their products will lose all of their value before they have another opportunity to sell them. And keeping half of their value is better than losing all of it. And to be clear, it's the fact that money can be hoarded without loss that gives the holder of money this advantage over the producers of real goods. What if the community had instead decided to issue new money at the beginning of each market day, thereby making the money from previous market days worthless after the day it was issued? In that case, holders of money would be on an equal footing with producers of goods. Such expiring money would be a pure medium of exchange and would not be suitable for use as a store of value. As we've argued in previous videos, it's the fact that these two incompatible functions, medium of exchange and store of value, have been combined in our existing form of money that gives rise to all of the problems we've discussed, such as unemployment, poverty, and recurring economic crises. And this hypothetical thought experiment illustrates why this is the case. So returning to Keynes, it's important to note that he was a product of the classical school. He studied and taught the classical theory in the early part of his career and considered it valid under certain circumstances. However, he viewed it as an incomplete description of the real economy. His own theory was meant to expand upon the classical theory, not to replace it. According to the classical school, long-term economic weakness and widespread unemployment should never exist. This is due to what's referred to as Say's law, named after the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, who worked in the early 1800s. Say's law basically argues that economic supply creates its own demand. In other words, by creating goods and services for sale on the market, producers generate the purchasing power necessary to buy all of the goods and services available on the market. Therefore, a situation in which there is insufficient demand to buy all of the available goods and services should be an impossibility, since the production that goes on in the economy should create enough demand to buy the entire output of the economy. So according to the classical model, a persistent situation of oversupply of goods and services and widespread unemployment should never exist. But Keynes lived and worked during the Great Depression, which directly contradicted the classical view of the economy. So Keynes's work can be seen as an effort to expand upon the classical view in order to account for the depressed state of the world economy that he lived through. Because according to the economic orthodoxy that prevailed prior to Keynes, what happened during the Great Depression should have been impossible. Temporary economic weakness should have caused wages and prices to fall until they reached a level at which all willing, able-bodied workers could be profitably employed, and the wages earned by those workers should have been sufficient to buy all of the output of the economy. But year after year in the 1930s, this failed to happen. One of Keynes's most important insights had to do with the role of money in the economy. The classical view basically ignores money and treats the economy as if it were made up purely of goods and services. Say's analysis explicitly minimized the role of money in the economic system, arguing that money is nothing but a medium of exchange and that the supply and demand of real goods and services is what ultimately determines overall economic performance. And to be clear, Say's law would be an accurate description of reality in a non-monetary, i.e. barter, economy. It's the introduction of money into the equation, and specifically its function as a store of value, that causes Say's law to be an inaccurate description of reality. And to repeat, it's the fact that money was deliberately designed to function as a store of value that causes this to be the case. If money was a pure medium of exchange, the hoarding of money would be impossible, and large-scale, persistent divergences between supply and demand would never exist. The possession of money would simply be a transitional step between selling and buying, a temporary situation that only lasts until the seller of goods and/or services has made a purchase for the same amount as was received in the previous sale. But by designing money in such a way that it can be hoarded indefinitely without penalty, we fundamentally compromised its ability to perform its function as a medium of exchange. And according to Keynes, this was the root cause of the Great Depression. Say's law didn't work. Supply did not create its own demand. And this was because money was hoarded and failed to circulate, and the world's governments and central banks were powerless to force it to circulate. We should note that much the same thing happened following the financial crisis of 2008. In response to the economic weakness caused by the collapse of the mortgage market, the world's central banks created huge, unprecedented quantities of new money. But most of that money just sat in banks and failed to circulate. Under our present monetary system, there's very little that governments and central banks can do to force money to circulate. And that situation would be fundamentally different under the form of money proposed by Silvio Gesell. In the interest of time, we'll pause the discussion at this point. In the next video, we'll delve further into Keynes's interpretation of the phenomenon of interest, and we'll start to explore the connection between Keynes and Gesell. Thanks for watching.